I am so excited to announce that I have released the first official tarot diagnosis spread book. Tarot and Self-Discovery is a therapeutic tarot journey with over 200 spreads, including over 152 card prompts and over 50 robust tarot spreads. You can purchase a physical copy on Amazon or a digital copy at thetarotdiagnosis.com. You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. We are diving into the world of shadow work today, and this exploration is actually going to be guided by the Sun card, which might seem odd, but it's actually an incredibly fitting card for a discussion on shadow work. So the Sun card is an archetype of healing, clarity, and creation. And this archetype encourages us to seek truth, shine authentically, and also allow ourselves to step into a place of personal revelation, growth, and healing. Essentially, our shadow is everything that we dislike about ourselves. It's everything that we don't want to see, don't want to acknowledge. We want to keep it hidden. We might be ashamed of it. So to bring the Sun card into shadow work is to bring healing into shadow work. I'd like to spend some time giving some background and discuss shadow work before we really get into the meat of it. And also, you'll want to hang around because I'm going to do a very shadow work specific exercise that is rooted in theories of both Carl Jung, who created or is most known for the concept of shadow work, and also Sigmund Freud, who Jung actually worked alongside to create a concept similar to shadow work with Freud. So we're going to get into all kinds of nitty gritty, like OG psychology work. So stay tuned for that exercise. It'll be more towards the end of the episode, but it's going to be really fun. I'm going to be pulling cards, and yeah, we're going to really get into it. The concept of shadow work is rooted in the theories of Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology. You are probably very familiar with his name. His name gets spoken about a lot in the tarot and kind of occult or occult adjacent communities. So Jung introduced the idea of the shadow as an essential aspect of our inner world, this personal landscape that we are often navigating, within our own minds and in our own psyche. And the term shadow in this context refers to the parts of ourselves that we suppress, repress, and deny. And that's often because of societal expectations, cultural norms, childhood messaging that we receive from parents, caregivers, teachers, or friends, and also any sort of personal trauma that we've experienced can contribute to our shadow. These hidden aspects of our personality can include our fears, our insecurities, unacknowledged desires, unresolved conflicts personally or interpersonally, and even our neurodiversities that we've been conditioned to, quote, mask and feel ashamed of. Another important part of shadow work is actually a misconception. And there's this misconception that shadow work is this really dark, evil, maybe even psychopathic part of ourselves that we must confront in order to be self-actualized. And I think that that's more of the allure of shadow work is like, ooh, let's find these like deep, dark, evil parts of ourselves. But unfortunately, the true, real meaning of the shadow gets lost then in translation because the shadow can also be lighter parts of ourselves. It could be the curious child who liked to ask questions a lot growing up, but was reprimanded for being too nosy or too much. So the child learned that in order to appease the adults or the authority figures around them, they needed to repress this side of themselves. And that's how a shadow forms. Then as the child gets older, they may begin to project this shadow onto others. So if they meet someone or they even have their own child who is curious and likes to ask questions and find out information, they might become incredibly uncomfortable. The shadow part gets activated. They might scoff at this person or get annoyed with their child and even ask things like, well, why are you so curious? Or why are you asking that, in these condescending ways, which then perpetuates this shadow cycle. And actually, this example reflects a quote that a lot of you are probably familiar with, attributed to Carl Jung, where he talks about how what irritates us about others is what we dislike about ourselves. So it's a prime example of the cycle of the shadow continuing and seeing what we dislike about ourselves and others and finding ourselves projecting and responding in a way that is unfavorable. Jung is most known for his exploration of the collective unconscious, which is where the concept of the shadow originates. And we can call the collective unconscious this reservoir of shared human experiences and shared archetypal symbols that end up shaping our individual psyches that are shared cross-culturally. In Jungian psychology, the shadow again represents these dark, hidden, mysterious, and neglected parts of ourselves. And the shadow ends up being this container of everything that we are afraid of or that we think is unacceptable, whether like socially or personally within ourselves. So you can think of the shadow as like a box. And in that box, we put everything that maybe we are afraid deems us undesirable or unacceptable. And we want to like put everything in this container, leave it in the container, put the lid on and shove it in a dark, dusty closet and never see it again. But we understand that doing that is actually a denial of the self. And at some point, we're going to open that dusty, dark closet, searching around for something that is not our shadow. And inevitably, this box is either going to show itself and we're going to see it and be reminded of it, or maybe we're rummaging around this dark, dusty closet that has way too much stuff in it. We all have one. From a metaphorical perspective and non-metaphorical perspective. And maybe even the box like falls over and the lid pops off and then we're forced to confront these shadow parts because they've spilled out. And when this happens, it's important to remember that grabbing those shadow parts, looking at them, observing them, even shoving them back in the box and putting the box away is still a courageous, vulnerable act. And then when we engage in an intentional process of shadow work, we're bringing these hidden parts of ourselves to the surface and into conscious awareness. And that willingness to shine a light on them, again, bringing the sun card back into this, means that we are willing to experience something incredibly uncomfortable in order to grow and in order to heal. So we're really gifting ourselves something. It's the ultimate process of looking in the mirror, and that can be incredibly hard and scary. This is an endeavor to confront and integrate the parts of ourselves that we've ignored, that we've disowned, that others have disowned and then have made us feel like we're also supposed to disown. And another important reminder here is all of this happens out of a very specific or for a very specific purpose. And it's because we've needed to keep ourselves safe. So that's why shadow work can feel so destabilizing sometimes, because when we start to acknowledge certain parts of ourselves that we've been trying to keep hidden, we suddenly don't feel safe. But when we bring the sun card into it and we shine a light on our shadow and we grant ourselves permission to explore these subconscious terrains and we create and hold space for ourselves to understand the root of our fears and our anxieties and our destructive patterns, we are allowing ourselves to experience our true authentic self. And when we're our true authentic self, we're often without intense anxiety, without intense depression, without intense fear. So I've already kind of alluded to why shadow work is important. But to drive the point home a little bit more, it's because when we have unexamined parts of ourselves, those parts, even though they're unexamined, still have a significant influence on our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, and our relationships. It can sabotage any sort of personal growth we've done outside of shadow work. It can hinder our happiness and really limit our potential. So by finding the courage to engage in shadow work, we're giving ourselves permission to gain confidence and feel liberated in our true selves. Something important to note is that we tend to use the term shadow work pretty loosely in our communities, but the reality is this work is anything but light and loose. And it's not something that can be done through a single tarot spread or a few exercises. These tools, one of which I'm going to show you today, are absolutely helpful on your journey. But you have to remember that this process is ongoing. I believe that we are forever going to be discovering and tending to our shadows throughout our life. So this isn't like a one and done process where you're like, oh, I'm going to do some shadow work today and be good tomorrow. When you say you're doing shadow work, what you're saying is that you are stepping into a place where you know that you're going to be stepping in and out of, maybe pretty regularly, and being willing to experience things that are uncomfortable, figuring out how they have impacted other parts of your life, figuring out what changes you need to make in order for integration to happen, for you to live a more consistent and fulfilling life, and know that this is a process that is going to ebb and flow. When I think of the Sun card, I think of wholeness. I think of life. I think of creation and nature and the bigger picture. And with shadow work, the shadow is the part of ourselves that, again, we're repressing because essentially it is inconsistent with who we think we are when we think of us as whole. We don't want this shadow component to be included in the big picture. But really, shadow work means that we're unpacking these moments in history when the authentic parts of ourselves that we need in order to feel whole were not compassionately cultivated, but instead forced to be discarded. So doing this work means that now we have to go rummage through this landfill of memory and experiences in order to find those remnants of ourself, of the shadow, and piece them back together in order to create one whole image of ourselves, one whole complete landscape of who we are. And you have to remember, one, I love a good metaphor, a good garden metaphor. If you've been listening for a while, you know that. Gardens are not perfect. You're constantly pulling weeds. You're constantly trying to prevent and be on the lookout for pests. And shadow work is no different. Earlier, I had mentioned that I was going to get into some of the nitty-gritty in terms of psychology and Freud and Jung and how they work together to create this concept of the shadow and Freud's own concept, which is shadow adjacent. So to give you a little bit of background on that in a way that's not giving a full course on psychology, Sigmund Freud created the concept of the id, the ego, and the superego. And Carl Jung actually was with him and helped create and establish the concept of the id, the ego, and the superego, which I'll explain in a moment. But once Jung split from Freud and went off to do his own thing, he ended up coining a very similar concept, which is what we now know as the shadow self. So I feel like having a basic foundation of knowledge of the id, the ego, and the superego is actually really important when you're approaching shadow work. So to explain more about the id, the ego, and the superego, the id is the impulsive part of our personality. And this impulsive part of us is driven by pleasure and the need to feel good. And it is repulsed by pain and discomfort and shame and darkness. So you can think of the id as the part of us that really just wants all that dopamine and serotonin. And it will do whatever it can to avoid anything that might take that away from us. The superego is the judgmental part of us, and not even a negative judgmental. It's just the judge. And it's the morally correct part of our personality. So you can even think of the superego as like our wise part. Like, ooh, what is the most morally correct way to respond or react in any given situation? And then the ego is the conscious part of us that is constantly mediating between the id and the superego in order to make the final decision on what we should do. So a while back, I ended up creating a tarot spread based on this specific concept of the id, the ego, and the superego. And I've since expanded on it, and you can find this in one of the offerings on the website, thetarotdiagnosis.com. I believe it's the Shadow Work Guide, the Shadow Work through Self-Acceptance workbook. So this is a 6-card spread and can be kind of meaty, but the core, the 3 main cards actually represent the id, the ego, and the superego. So I figured it would be fun to walk you through what it sounds like to do this exercise. And you can grab your cards and pull alongside me, and we can explore our shadow self together. All right, so card 1 is going to represent the id. And the question for card 1 is, what subconscious motivations do you have that drive your impulses? So let's shuffle and see what comes up. So because this is a shadow work episode, I've decided to use Tarot of the Abyss, which feels very much like a shadow worky deck to me. There's a lot of layers and emotional imagery throughout this deck, which I feel lend itself nicely to the concept of shadow work. Okay, so the id, subconscious motivations that drive our impulses. So we have the 4 of Pentacles. This actually feels incredibly fitting for subconscious motivations, because when we think about the 4 of Pentacles, it's a card rooted in fear. We're holding so tightly onto this pentacle at our chest area. And then we've got a pentacle above our head and 2 below our feet. And there's a preoccupation that exists with this card, a preoccupation with needing to feel secure, or even a preoccupation with material possessions. But at its core, we're holding on incredibly tightly to something, usually something that we need. And remember, the id represents the part of us that is driven by pleasure and repulsed by pain. So for the 4 of Pentacles, I feel like the question might then be, what is it that I'm holding on to so tightly that protects me from feeling pain? And this could be all kinds of things, like depending on who you are and what's happening in your life at any given moment. Something that I find interesting about this card, though, is that it also feels like a card of isolation. So when we think about subconscious motivations that drive our impulses, and we pair this card with the concept of isolation, we might also then have to ask ourselves, what stops me from connecting with others? Why am I holding on to this isolation so much? It could be a fear of getting hurt. We want to feel pleasure and we want to avoid pain. So we're doing whatever we can to make sure that we're not in any sort of danger. So the subconscious motivation for this card might be, I need to hold on tightly to myself and my belongings and not create a space that is inviting of other people, because other people could hurt me. Let's move on to card 2, which is the superego. So this card asks, what personality traits help keep our impulses and primal demands in check? Because remember, the superego is the morally correct part of us. It's the part that's trying to tell us to do the right, quote unquote, right thing. Oh my God. Wow. Okay. Yep, that checks. So 6 of Wands. Oh my God. That's hilarious. It's almost like too good. It's too good. So what personality traits help keep our impulses and primal demands in check? The 6 of Wands. The need to be good, the need to be perceived as accomplished, the need to be seen as doing the right thing, the need to be seen as not lazy, the need to be seen as driven and accomplished and successful, the need for our outside persona to be one that's accepted. I feel like that's almost too perfect for that card, or for that question, rather. All right, let's keep moving. So card 3 is the ego. And this asks, how does your conscious balance your inner primal urges and your logic and morals? So again, remember, the ego is the conscious part of ourselves that acts as the mediator between the id and the superego. So it's acting as the mediator between the part of us that is driven by impulse and wanting to constantly feel pleasure over pain, and then the superego, which is kind of our personality trait that keeps, our primal demands in check. And it's the part of us that wants to be morally correct and present a very specific way. So how does our ego balance these two things? How does it balance our primal urges with our logic and our morals? Ooh, the 5 of Wands. This is fascinating because I think that it's an accurate representation of the struggle that the ego can experience here. Because with the 5 of Wands, there's clearly a conflict. There's a bit of competition, but there's also an air of lightness to this card that I think we don't often give it enough credit for. But at the end of the day, oh my gosh, the ego in this context represented by the 5 of Wands feels so right. The 5 of Wands depicting this conflict or this kind of minor struggle really shows that there's something that happens here. It's not easy for the ego to just, balance out our primal urges and our logic and morals. There's a whole act that takes place, and there's a bit of a struggle, and there has to be space held for that. But because this card isn't super heavy, I think that it's important to note that we can say, okay, well, how does it balance the primal urges and the logic and morals? It doesn't take ourselves too seriously. Whereas like the superego, that takes us super seriously. The superego, especially as represented by the 6 of Wands, very rigid, like really wants this specific image portrayed, wants to experience this very specific thing. Same with the id. Only wants to experience pleasure, wants to avoid pain and discomfort at all costs, where the ego understands that it is not all or nothing. It is not black and white. And with the 5 of Wands, there is going to be a struggle between the two. And sometimes there isn't a clear winner or a clear loser. Okay, let's keep moving. So the expanded part of this spread includes 3 additional cards. Card 4 asks, how can I practice being more aware of the internal and external process of the shadow self? Okay. We got the Fool. This is interesting for this question. My immediate interpretation of this card for how we can practice being more aware of this internal and external process of the shadow self is to approach it with a sense of curiosity and to combat the fear that we might have in terms of exploring what the shadow self is like and what that process is when you're doing shadow work. I think it's also a reminder to not take this process too seriously. Shadow work should absolutely not be taken lightly, but at the same time, we are all flawed human beings. None of us are perfect. Life is messy. And I think sometimes we need to just have a sense of humor about what it's like to be human. It's often really fucked up and it often doesn't make sense. And I feel like the Fool is showing up to say, hey, you can be more aware of the internal and external process of the shadow self by not being so rigid with the process. It's not black and white. It's not all or nothing. Sometimes it's going to make sense and sometimes it's not. Sometimes you'll think you're headed down one path and you end up in a totally different path, and being willing to be flexible, knowing that it's okay if you veer off course. There's no right way to do this. As long as you're being compassionate and curious, you're going to make progress. Okay, let's move on to card 5. So card 5 asks, how does my shadow self show up in my relationship with myself and with others? I love this question. It's the ultimate mirror question. How does your shadow self show up? What does it look like? Queen of Pentacles. Ooh, yeah, this makes sense. So maybe this is, well, it makes sense for me, and it might make sense for some of you too. This is clearly me projecting onto these questions. With the Queen of Pentacles, in terms of, that's how our shadow self shows up in relation to, myself and others. So I guess I'll speak personally. For me, okay, so let me just back up for a second. The Queen of Pentacles is this, I always think of this nurturing kind of mother figure. I have someone in my life who is my Queen of Pentacles. It's my Jane, who I love so much, who, was a neighbor several years ago and has never left my side, even though I've moved multiple times since being her neighbor. And she is just so incredibly important to me and has become like a pseudo mother or pseudo grandmother. And she's incredibly nurturing. And so to think of like how your shadow self shows up, I think for me, one of my shadow parts shows up when someone wants to nurture me or when someone wants to show me care, because there's a part of me that doesn't feel deserving of that and wants to run away or feels like a burden and then starts to feel incredibly uncomfortable and sometimes even painful. And I've had to do a lot of work on acknowledging that shadow part and that component that comes to the surface when someone wants to nurture me or show me that level of caretaking. This is why I love this question, because often we don't think about when our shadow self shows up. When does it become activated? So pulling a relatively positive card like the Queen of Pentacles might throw you off a little bit, but then you start to sit and think like, oh yeah, like there is a shadow part of me that shows up when I feel Queen of Pentacles energy, even though it's a very positive energy. This goes back to when I was talking earlier about how, it's not always these like, dark, evil parts of ourselves that are shadow work. Sometimes it is these parts of us where it's an inner child that feels like they were too much growing up. And so they had to hide their own needs in order to make sure everyone else around them was taken care of. I speak more about this on the Mother Wounds episode where I dive into all the queens actually. So go take a listen to that if you feel like this resonates with you. Okay, let's pull the final card for this spread. So card 6 asks, what lessons am I learning from my shadow work? Ten of Cups. Wow. Okay. We're going there. Oh, this card. Oh, this is so funny that this is the card I pulled for the lessons that I'm learning from shadow work. I think that this is applicable to all of us who are engaging in this type of work. And it's telling us that we are able to reach a state of contentment. At some point, we will get there. Tens also numerically represent completion or wholeness, which I think is a really beautiful way to think of the lessons that you're learning when you're engaging in shadow work. And it's that you are allowed to feel whole. You are allowed to feel complete, even when you have parts of yourself that you feel like are not that great or are undeserving or are dark or are unacceptable. All of these components of us are what make us whole, are what make us this 10 of Cups archetype. I hope this spread and this discussion today helped shine some light on your own personal shadow work journey. And I would love to hear from you all. Tell me what it was like for you to pull alongside me. What cards did you pull? What sort of insights did you gain? I always get so excited when I get emails from you all about how an episode impacted you or what cards you pulled. It's it's really nice knowing that this work is valuable to you all. So as you continue on this shadow work journey, I just want you to remember that even though this process can be really scary and difficult, you are paving the way for remarkable personal growth, self-acceptance, and personal and communal liberation. You're breaking the cycle of societal conditioning and giving yourself permission to show up as your true, authentic self. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.